for the introduction of the next speaker.
Yeah. The second session is on opportunities for physicians. And we have two speakers, one who will focus on clinical development possibilities and the other one on possibilities in medical affairs. So the first speaker is Anke van den Broek. She is currently medical director at Amgen BeLux, Belgium, Luxembourg. She has a medical degree and also a degree in abdominal surgery for a number of years, and with a specialty in hepatobiliary surgery and a PhD in pancreatic cancer. She moved since 2013 to Amgen in a number of different positions. She will talk about that. And as I was saying, she is now medical director there. So Anke, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. I will start sharing my screen. And actually today is a bit of a special day because it is actually exactly 8 years ago that I was on call for the last time, and I was performing my last cholecystectomy for acute cholecystitis. And when I drove home, that was really the time that I closed my chapter. That is chapter of my career as indeed an hepatobiliary surgeon. And 2 days later, I started this new chapter in the pharmaceutical industry. So I've been working for Amgen for 8 years now. It has been a bit of a roller coaster, a journey where I've learned a lot of new things. I have changed roles 5 times. I have worked in the local affiliate. I've worked in the regional office. I've done mainly jobs in medical affairs, but also in commercial affairs. And yes, as just mentioned, I am now the medical director of the BeLux affiliates. Honestly, when I made this career switch, I really had no clue of what was expected from me and which role I was entering. And so that's the reason why I'm very happy I was invited today. So I can maybe help that you are better prepared than I was 8 years ago. And therefore, these are my 2 main objectives of today. I really want to make you have a better understanding of the different roles and responsibilities for physician in clinical drug development, and also get you a bit more informed on the why, when, what, and how to make the switch to pharma industry. And I am aware that there are also other students here on the line. We were talking about pharmacy students, biomedical students, and some things I will mention do also apply for you. So hold on, it might be also interesting for you. Let's start first with some facts and figures. Like, who are those physicians that made the switch to pharma? They are actually quite rare. Currently, only 5% of the physicians make the switch, and it is a shame because the treatment landscapes are getting more and more complex, and we do need more physicians. The typically entry point of these physicians are medical affairs and R&D, and these are the 2 topics that will be discussed. So I will do R&D, and then Laura will do the medical affairs after me. Why do people make the switch? The motivation can be very diverse, but I think in general, often there is at least a scientific interest in the pathophysiology of the disease and the molecules. And secondly, really the aim to advance medical innovation and to advance medical innovation for a larger proportion of patients. So when to make the switch? This is a topic that we had already in the previous session. Some physicians make the switch very early in their career, just right after their studies. Others, like I do, we needed a little bit more time to think about it and do it later in the career. Some people do a PhD, some an MBA, and also in some countries you can really do a qualification as a pharmaceutical physician, like in the UK or Switzerland. But actually, there is no best and ideal way, as Christoph mentioned. At the end, you should really just follow your intuition. And I hope that with the presentation of today, we can fuel a little bit that intuition and make sure that you can make a good decision. It's, however, I think very important to realize that pharma industry is not the same as medicine practice. Not in all aspects, because I think the main goal remains the same. we really also want to improve the life of the patients. And to achieve this, you have to have this science-based attitude. You have to have this extensive knowledge of the disease and the treatment landscape, and you really always have to be on top of the latest information. And of course, for this, you have to interact with medical experts. But on the other hand, obviously there are differences. You don't have this direct patient contact anymore, and the effect of your actions are not on an individual patient level, but more on a larger scale, and often also on a longer term. You don't put your white coat on anymore. You don't have you're not really doctor with the individual recognition, but everything what you do is a team effort. In exchange, I think you are exposed to different functions, to different roles. You can learn a lot from different people, and you're really able to build a career plan. And for me, this is really the fun part, because as a physician, but definitely also as a pharmacy or a biomedical person, there are a lot of career opportunities. And like Christoph said, some come by coincidence, but there are so many options, and you can really grow and develop your part. So I wanted this as an introduction now to make it a little bit more concrete. I like this picture of Toby Freeman that tried to a bit visualize the different roles we have in the biopharmaceutical industry. And you have here the big elements, R&D, commercial operations, but you also have services and operation, and we will discuss this also today. As a physician, as discussed, you will mainly start here in clinical development and medical affairs, but you should definitely not limit yourself to these roles. I think everything is feasible, and it just depends where your interests are. What is now to say the biggest difference between R&D and medical affairs? So in R&D, you really want to support the clinical development of an asset from discovery until post-approval monitoring. And for this, you have different phases. You have the preclinical and a translational phase. You have the really clinical development with early until late stage. And then you have, of course, the element of drug safety and pharmacovigilance. In medical affairs, and this we'll discuss later, you really manage the commercialization of the molecule throughout the life cycle. So by this, you really have to have deep understanding of the clinical landscape, and this will help you to develop a medical strategy, to see a plan where there are still data gaps, to work on communication strategy, and to interact with all the experts. But today we will, my focus will anyway be on R&D. It's also important to know that R&D, so research, is often more a global responsibility within the company, and those roles are more global roles, because of course there is no difference in the clinical development plan for Italy versus France, for example. But in medical affairs, this is more, there you have opportunities to have roles both on the local level as on a regional level or on the global level, depending on how the company is structured. So what are responsibilities of a physician in clinical drug research? They are quite broad. It goes from really developing successful clinical research strategies, also being responsible of the correct and the safe execution of clinical trials. And of course, each data need to be published. So it's also your task to the publication of the study data. And for this, it's important that you are the link between the company and the clinical investigators. This is also very important to understand the data, because as a physician, you also have a role in evaluating the efficacy of new potential treatment in patients. And for this, you really need to understand the needs of the patient, but also the landscape. Something I wanted to add here, and I think it is maybe not often known by people that are not close to pharma, is that the pharmaceutical industry is a highly regulated environment. And sometimes the research that the pharma industry is doing is questioned, but I can compare really academic research with what my company at least is doing. And I can really reassure you that ethical behavior is embedded in what we do. And I'm quite sure this is the case for the majority of pharmacy industry. So don't be afraid of entering also company research. This again to go to the different stages of clinical development. You're probably quite aware of this evolution that a molecule goes through. And to come back, so physicians are needed throughout these phases. And I will focus on the 3 phases I mentioned before. So the preclinical and the translational research phase, the early late stage development, and then we'll also discuss drug safety and pharmacovigilance. So for the preclinical and translational research stage, what is your task? What is your responsibility here? Here you play a really role into identify and investigate the new molecules, but also new biomarkers, because often now they are just developed in parallel, to develop experimental strategies, but also have a good collaboration with the regulators. And we had this topics, and it's really nice that we can link to them in the previous presentations. But for example, one of the elements is an IND. So you have the investigational new drug application that you have to submit to the authorities to make sure you can go from preclinical to a clinical stage. And you have a very important role in authoring and reviewing these documents. Often for this kind of roles, they are looking for people with some experience in medicinal chemistry, in vivo testing, or pharmacology. And go to the next stage, to the clinical study stage, and it goes from early, so really first in human trial to phase 3 trials. You can see that this slide is containing a lot of words, and this is because there are a lot of tasks and responsibilities you can do within clinical development. And just in a high level, I think first of all, you have all the tasks that are really related to clinical trials, and this goes very broad. This can go from just developing of the protocol, looking at the proper execution of the trial, organizing meetings linked to the clinical trials, medical monitoring, reviewing of the data, and writing of the clinical study reports. Then there is all this thing that has to do with publishing the data, making sure you review all the manuscript and abstracts. Then, of course, a very important element is evaluating the data internally, because this will then determine if your product will move to a further stage, if this product is marketable or not. Because as you know, I think approximately only 9% of the products will come from phase 2 to being on the market. And it is at each different stage that the data will be reviewed, of course, with also the feedback from external opinion leaders. So it's really important to have the relationships with investigators and opinion leaders. And then the last one, as I mentioned, is also making sure that you review and review all the documents that are submitted to the regulatory agencies. There are a lot of responsibilities. There are also a lot of different roles, and these roles are there with expanding responsibilities. So often you start, for example, as a study responsible physician. So this is linked to one study when you are the contact person for PIs and you address questions. But then you can evolve towards the one that is developing the strategy or even overseeing the clinical development plan. And you can do this from one product to a therapeutic area. So you have a lot of career opportunities to grow from very study specific to more oversight roles. For these different roles, what they do, what is an asset, I think, is expertise as a principal investigator. Also expertise in the therapeutic area, and also when you have already this strong relationship with key stakeholders. And then the last stage, as mentioned, is this pharmacovigilance stage. And the idea is really that your goal is to make sure that the use of the medication can be done in a safe way. So it is your task to collect and monitor all the adverse events. So this is done, of course, both in clinical trials and in routine clinical practice. But for the topic of this discussion, as a safety scientist within a clinical trial, what you do is you collect and monitor the adverse events, and then you collaborate with your clinical development medical director to see, do we need to adjust the dose, or do we need to change the treatment schedule to make sure that we continue with the treatment in a safe way? And for this role, it's also an asset if you have already experience as a PI before. So I think this was probably a waterfall of information for all the different roles there are in clinical drug development. So I hope you are convinced that there is a lot, and it's also very, very interesting. To say that there are also many physicians that are qualified for this role, but as we had also in the previous session, if we hire people, we also look at other skills. For clinical development to be really successful, you should be at least detail oriented, because each detail counts for the patients. But you also need to be proactive. You need to have good leadership skills because you're working in a team. You should have a can-do attitude, and as well, you have to be a team player. So if you think that this is of interest of you and you think that you really have all these soft skills, I could give you the following advice. I think it is important that you dare to take risk. We mentioned it already, a career is more like a repetition of coincidence. I always say I was very lucky in my career, but it's also because I dare to take risk. They asked me to do a role. You think, okay, it's of interest of me. I just tried and I just do it. And for this, I think you should have a deliberate career plan. You should a bit know what you want to do, but make it flexible so you're still open-minded for things that come and pass your way. And the other thing I would share with you is make sure you know your strengths and interests, but also that you know your development areas, and you should always aim to become a better you. So that was, I think, the most what I wanted to share. So there was a lot of sites for information on this, but we have also a Q&A at the end, I think.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anke. Very interesting, really, your talk. And now, yes, we open the discussion at the end of this session after the talk by Laura Salvi. Laura Salvi is a medical doctor with a specialization